everyone, and welcome to our session. Thank you. Thank you for your patience today. We're really excited to be here, and we're going to talk to you today about designing XR tools with disability inclusion in mind. Very important, as we all have seen, XR is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, but it's so important that it's born accessible, which means a lot of things, and we're going to cover a lot of them today. But before we dive in, we're going to go over a little bit of introductions. My name is Ashley Coffey. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an emerging technologies lead at the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technologies, also known as PEAT. PEAT. We foster collaborations that make emerging technologies accessible to people with disabilities so that we can build a future that works. And it's important to emphasize how much of an imperative this is, especially at a conference like this. It's so important to build in accessibility at the very beginning. And this is an initiative supported by the Department of Labor. So we're really excited to be here. And then I'm going to kick it over to this awesome person sitting next to me, Meryl Evans.
Howdy, my pronouns are she, her. I am an disability consultant and professional speaker who was born hearing free, or in medical term, profoundly deaf. So one of the most common assumptions people make about me is that I know sign language. I don't, but that is neither a good or a bad thing. It just is. When you've met one deaf person, you've met one deaf person. We're all different. I've been working with Xr Access to educate people on the why and how to build accessible XR experiences. I am the co-host of Ali VR, a monthly meetup that covers topics related to accessibility in VR.
Yes, and just so you know, we're going to cover a lot of ground today. There's a lot of resources, so we'll show links at the very end that you can access all of this stuff. But buckle up. So story time a little bit to kind of set the scene here and understanding why it's so important. So a brief little story from myself here. When I was an emerging technologies librarian at the University of Oklahoma, we would bring in students to explore hominid skulls in VR, and we built our own open source platform to be able to build in like 3D assets. And there was a moment where we brought in a class, and I was helping some students, and I was giving verbal instructions to a student on viewing a hominid skull. And there was a moment of silence, and she looked at me, and I was trying to figure out like, well, if I was doing something wrong, or like, was I not describing it correctly? And then I realized, and she told me, she's like, I'm deaf. And that was
me.
It was not Meryl. And that was the moment I realized, like, oh my gosh, like, it's such a simple thing. Why didn't we think of that at the very beginning? So therefore, we went back and made design processes and iterations. But that was like the aha moment for me of like, oh my gosh, we cannot perpetuate exclusion cycles that are here in like 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional spaces. That'll make it even worse. So, but I want to hear Meryl's story. So Meryl, please share yours.
Quick version, Thomas Logan and I hold our Ali VR meetup in a virtual reality setting. So when Ashley was our guest speaker, we decided to hold it in a different VR setting than we normally do. We all met in their environment to rehearse, and we got a surprise, not the good kind. And I felt shut out. I felt locked out because I had no way of communicating or knowing what they were saying. There was no chat box. And while the setting had captions, it cost extra. Accessibility should never cost extra. So I found a creative workaround. That environment has sticky notes. We turn the sticky notes into a chat box of sorts. So we make all of our events, our Ali VR events, we do a lot of creative workarounds because most of these environments don't have accessible. They're not accessible.
Exactly, and that was just a real true moment of like, oh my gosh, it's 2022, why is there not alternative means of communication in a virtual environment? And this is a pretty mainstream platform, so yeah, take note. We're going to dive into a few examples here to show how some things are getting some creative workarounds. And we want to emphasize here, though, we don't want to glorify workarounds because workarounds shouldn't be a solution. It's a creative process, like it's a design challenge, right? But it should never be a scenario in which a business leader or a developer says, oh, they have a workaround, so we don't need to invest time in accessibility.
Exactly.
Wrong. You should invest time in accessibility. So this is a great example. Meryl, do you want to talk us through this example as I
Sure.
play it?
So I am on the W3C immersive caption group, and we experimented with meeting and collaborating in a virtual reality setting. The clip shows what I see through my virtual reality set. Captions appear on the right side of the room. We imported them as a shared object from a web browser. I don't love the uppercase, but there's a progress, not perfection. So on the left side are the meeting attendees who view the scene on a video meeting platform or through a browser on their computer or device. So there are multiple ways to enter or view the scene. Several of us enter the room through our VR headset. We're sitting at a table with people watching the scene from the other side. Shoot, play, play.
It's actually not working, which is probably a good thing. So yes, if you would like to see the clip later, please find us afterwards. But as you can see, Meryl was describing the captions that are here on the left-hand side. The avatar that you see is Miles Sebastian. He's signing in VR using the little cameras on the outside of the headset. I mean, hand tracking, what a great use. The second example here is from the Accessibility VR meetup that Meryl talked about earlier. Yeah, so this is the immersive environment we were in. We were presenting. Tim Stutz, who's an amazing designer, definitely check out his work. And check out this talk, too, from Accessibility VR meetup, because he talks about multimodal inputs and the importance of diverse multimodal inputs. And specifically, we're talking here the examples of the Magic Leap design of the different battery, it's just something that should extend to all areas of the hardware and the software and the procurement and the implementation and deployment. So we cover all of this in our PEAT, Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technologies, Xr Toolkit that we recently just published, which outlines inclusive design principles. So if you leave with anything today, leave with these principles. It doesn't really matter what department you work in, if you're a product designer or a developer, these principles are agnostic to you. So we hope that you learned something new. So let's kind of dive in here to talk a little bit more about inclusive design. And there are 3 XR accessibility viewpoints that I want you all to consider when designing XR tools with disability inclusion in mind. And the first one is core hardware and platform software accessibility, OS. So making your core XR hardware platform software and embedding your operating system level apps and making sure they're accessible, not treating them as an afterthought. Second, use XR as an assistive technology. It's already existing. You can use XR to build new kinds of assistive technologies to improve access for people with disabilities. And third, inclusive design aids XR innovation. Like that whole design challenge example of you using a sticky note. I mean, that's a great example here, inclusive design. Given immersive and XR technology involves a lot of wearables and spatialized interactions, designing for human diversity can aid in innovation and usability, which is a great segue into something that we really like to talk about. Maybe you've heard it before. It's called curb cuts. Meryl, take us home with some curb cuts.
So this is my dad in the black and white photo from when he was a good humor man in Brooklyn, New York, long before I was born. Do you notice the ramp in front of his truck that is called a curb cut? The initial purpose for it was to provide a ramp to allow wheelchairs to cross the street. The curb cut ended up helping a lot more people. Parents pushing strollers, travelers pulling luggage, shoppers pushing carts, workers pulling heavy loads. Thankfully, ramps are not just found on street corners. You find them at airports, grocery stores, office buildings, and many other places. That's the curb cut effect. Making your XR accessible will have a curb cut effect. Captions are the best example of that. 80% of the people who use captions are not deaf or hard of hearing. That's a lot. Yes, so that's why you want to ensure your XR experiences are accessible and inclusive from the start. It will ensure the maximum number of people use it. People with disabilities are the largest minority group in the world, and it's one that anyone can join at any time. People can become situationally, temporarily, and episodically impaired at any time. But guys, we all have something in common. Amira, we're getting older. Data shows that there's a high likelihood that people will have experienced a disability later in life. So, when you make everything accessible and inclusive, you are helping your future self.
Yes.
Back to you.
Exactly. I mean, just like Dylan Fox mentioned in the panel yesterday, we're all going to experience a situational, a temporary, permanent disability at some point in our lives. So, like, think for your future self. Think for things beyond what is currently existing, because it impacts everyone. It impacts everyone. So let's talk through just a few additional dimensions of inclusive design here. It's important to recognize diversity and uniqueness. So design beyond the average user, and so offer choices and flexibility.
There's no average.
There's no average user. No average user. Second, inclusive processes and tools. You should include diverse perspectives and include people with lived experiences so you can collaborate in inclusive ways. There's a large company here in California that does something with your employee resource groups. It's called like diversity network associations. Love that. So leverage your employee resource groups within your organizations. You shouldn't be designing things for people without people. So they say nothing about us without us. We had a conversation about that this morning of like nothing without us. I like that.
Period.
Yeah.
Nothing without, we're going to end with that, but that's okay. So nothing without us is taking a step further, because it means you have people with disabilities in your organization. Mm-hmm. That are already there. Now you have to include them.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads to leveraging the curb cut effects and that broader value for the technology as a whole. And inclusive design really does benefit everyone. And specifically with this one, we're going to move into the design principles really quickly. And like I mentioned earlier, these are all part of the PEAT Xr toolkit that you can visit afterward. We go through this in a much more in-depth, but sometimes people don't like the background or the audio in a virtual environment. And inclusive design ensures that people with disabilities have the ability to remove or change background details and audio details. And this can allow them to personalize their experience and their preferences. And another factor is to provide an undo and a redo function. How many times have you been in a VR environment, you couldn't do a redo, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to delete all of this, start over. It's frustrating. Another factor is the opportunity to undo, because it helps us get back and we don't have to ensure do we enter it again, and sometimes we just do things. And finally, allow users to change the speed of the program. Sometimes the program moves too fast and you need to slow it down to absorb the content. And another tool is to increase the time for making decisions. Like timeout windows sometimes have a very short. It's bizarre. So people can't always quickly move quickly enough to make decisions, or they get sidetracked and need more time. So great principles for inclusive design for all here. And then let's talk about inclusive design for mobility disabilities here. So you want to allow the use of alternate controllers and ensure that your app lets them use alternate or separate controllers or sensors. I highly recommend checking out Walk-in VR. It's a Walk-in VR driver, WALKIN VR, and which makes it possible for people with disabilities, with mobility disabilities, to interact in immersive environments. It's incredible. Highly recommend checking it out. If we had more time, I'd talk about it more.
We have a demo on the equalentry.com website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mentioned the curb cut effect earlier of the sitting mode for people in wheelchairs. Make sure the application allows for reclining and stationary positions, as well as the ability to move around without moving your bodies. There are a lot of experiences out there that require you to do some strange things. But I mean, one really positive thing out of this recently, real-time use, is in the MetaQuest store, you can now search for experiences by seated or standing position. Great. Progress over perfection, not caption.
We're still waiting on that.
We're getting there. Progress, yeah. And we're going to cover inclusive design for blind or low vision. So when designing for people who are blind or have low vision, it's important to provide text-to-speech capabilities. And this works like a screen reader and reads everything on the screen out loud. So when you offer audio-based interfaces as an alternative to visual interfaces, it informs the user or employee about what's happening in the scene. One example of this that I really like to point out to is Mozilla Hubs has a really good model of this. When someone's speaking, their head like vibrates, pulses.
But that kind of is progress, not perfection,
Yeah.
because it's distracting for some people.
But it's an indication that the person is speaking, so you generally know what direction to look
Yeah.
in. And again, this is all from the PEAT, Xr, and Hybrid Work Toolkit, but to cover the rest of these inclusive design principles, I'm going to kick it over to Meryl to talk about inclusive design for people who are deaf and hard of hearing.
Oh, speaking of, well, we were just talking about the bobbing head, and there's a thing called Schrodinger alley cat. Alley being A11Y, which is another way of saying accessibility. There's always a possibility that something you do for accessibility will also be a problem with somebody else in terms of accessibility. So it's very hard to have 100% accessible. So that's why we say progress over perfection a lot. Now, in designing for the deaf and hard of hearing, you want to provide, obviously, captions or subtitles for audio, not just for spoken words, but also music, lyrics, and sound. And then when I'm on a video call, sometimes I hear a sound, and I start looking around me to see where it's coming from, and most of the time, it's coming from someone else's video. And clearly, I have no ability to figure out where the sound comes from. Sometimes the person speaking or whoever's making the sound is not in your view. So you want to add icons or some other indicator to let people know which direction the sound is coming from. You can provide sign language interpreters in immersive settings. At a meetup, we did that by sharing the video of the person signing inside that virtual reality environment. Not everyone has the same amount of hearing in both ears, so allow them to switch from stereo to mono audio, let them wear their headphones. And finally, always provide at least 2 communication options. Earlier, I mentioned that I couldn't communicate in a virtual environment, as you could only communicate one way, audibly. So you always have to second one. Not everybody can hear, not everybody wants to speak, not everybody wants to type, so you want to have a variety of options. And now on to neurodivergent. So allow people to change the content display and experiment with the interface and control to help them limit noise, reduce motion, and display shorter text. I caption because it helps the group as well and give them the ability to turn off background audio, which can be distracting and sensory overload, and highlight important information to ensure they don't miss it. All content should use plain language. Study after study has shown everybody prefers plain language, even educated people. So with the study that the more educated you are, the greater preference you have for plain language. Amazing, huh? All right, so deliver the content with scaffolding. This means starting with the simple stuff and working their way to the more challenging one, and then to ensure an employee is successful in Xr, give them the opportunity to experiment and play with the program interface and control before starting any challenges or training tasks.
Whew, a lot. We covered a lot there. I hope you learned something. Thank you so much, Meryl. So let's kind of bring this all together and let's talk about the areas in the future of work that can benefit from practicing intentional inclusion.
So the key to doing that is to include people with disabilities throughout the entire product development process. Better yet, hire people with disabilities who are qualified, of course. And then you'll have an internal brain trust that you can tap into every day. And as we mentioned earlier, nothing about us without us, but we want to take it to another level and make it nothing without us by having people with disabilities in your company. And remember, this is very important, one person cannot represent the entire disability category. So it would not be a good idea to interview me to represent all of deaf and hard of hearing people. No way. I cannot speak for many others because we all have different backgrounds. And then inclusive technologies are the key to business success. Accessibility must be a top priority for employers and integrated into organization-wide diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So many people, so many companies brag, we're good at DEI, but they are missing people with disabilities. So this will ensure all employees, including those with disabilities, can easily use the company's tools. So think about how technology will be used by employees with different sensory, physical, and cognitive needs, including those, again, with temporary or situational limitations. For example, you walk into a noisy environment, now you can't hear anything. So we can, people can lose their sense of hearing just because it gets noisy. Or you get sick and you have a cold, you can't hear. So, and then assess whether the technology is flexible and supports different input modalities as well as interaction modes. For example, supporting different ways of communicating, voice, text, sign language, might help employees in quiet or loud environments.
Yes, Meryl, very well said. And we have a lot of really great resources linked here. But one thing before you all leave, we have a really important announcement to make. Are you ready? The Xr Access Symposium is happening next Thursday and Friday. You should come so you can learn more about inclusive XR. The Xr Access Symposium, this is the 4th annual symposium. It's a fantastic initiative. It's built with volunteers from public, private, nonprofit, and it's really an initiative to make sure that XR is born accessible and our community is so vibrant and diverse. So please join us. Would love to hear you, would love to have you come and view our different types of talks and research.
We have a QR code if you want to come up and talk to us after, and you can scan it and get more information. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.